They said he was too young, too bold, too dangerous. At just 36, Ibrahim Traoré was mocked by regional elites accused of economic madness for rejecting the CFA franc. Some even threatened legal sanctions, branding his push for a new currency as financial sabotage. But as cameras rolled at the West African summit in Accra, something unexpected happened. When Alassane Ouattara reached out with a smile for a symbolic handshake, Traoré didn't move. He stared through the performance and declared, "Self-reliance isn't negotiated, it's lived." That moment shattered illusions and marked the birth of the new African money movement. If you believe that Africa deserves leaders who stand tall, speak truth, and refuse to bow to foreign pressure, then this is the channel for you. We tell the real stories behind the headlines. Stories of resistance, of dignity, of the rise of a new Africa, led by voices like Ibrahim Traoré. They called him reckless. In backroom conversations among diplomats, Ibrahim Traoré was dismissed as an impulsive military man playing politics. His youth, his refusal to wear Western suits, and his uncompromising tone made him an easy target for ridicule. During one regional economic summit, a high-ranking advisor from Côte d'Ivoire was overheard mocking Traoré's proposal for financial sovereignty, calling it the fantasy of a child raised on rebellion. Others weren't so subtle. A block of francophone officials hinted at sanctions against Burkina Faso if it continued pushing for new African money, a pan-African currency initiative that would replace the CFA franc with a fully independent system. But Traoré wasn't naive. He knew the mockery, the threats, the veiled insults, they weren't really about him. They were symptoms of a deeper fear. The fear of a united Africa breaking free from the chains of economic dependency. While others scrambled for photo ops and aid packages, he studied trade maps, organized local economists, and met in secret with youth-led cooperatives. His vision was clear, a continent no longer begging but building. Then came the moment that changed everything. At the summit in Accra, when Alassane Ouattara extended his hand before the media, Traoré saw not an opportunity but a trap. Accepting would signal conformity, so he refused. And in that silence, louder than any insult hurled his way, he declared something unshakable. African self-reliance is no longer a dream, it's a decision. One handshake at a time. If this message speaks to your soul, don't just watch, be part of the movement. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to stay connected. Your voice matters. Together we rise. The backlash came swiftly. Within hours of the handshake incident, media outlets across the region published scathing headlines. Traoré disrespects African unity, captain of chaos, Burkina Faso's isolation begins. Pundits on television accused him of undermining diplomacy and disrespecting an elder statesman. Social media platforms were flooded with coordinated smear campaigns, calling him a radical, a puppet of foreign agitators, even an enemy of peace. The message was clear. Traoré had violated the unspoken code of silence, and he would pay the price. Behind closed doors, certain leaders pressured the African Union to censure Burkina Faso. Others pushed for economic sanctions disguised as regional stabilizing measures. But Traoré remained unmoved. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't issue a statement defending his actions. Instead, he returned to Ouagadougou and met with young economists, village cooperatives, and tech entrepreneurs who had been working under the radar on a shared dream, new African money, a currency free from colonial oversight, rooted in regional resources and blockchain transparency. The project had been quietly taking shape, but now it had a symbol. That moment of refusal broadcast across the continent had become a catalyst. It wasn't about disrespecting Ouattara. It was about refusing to pretend that a handshake could erase decades of betrayal. In the weeks that followed, youth-led rallies erupted across West Africa. From Bamako to Bissau, students marched with signs that read, "We choose dignity, no more fake peace and new African money now." Artists painted murals of Traore standing tall, hand at his side, while others bowed to external powers. For the first time in years, a political act, not a war, not a coup, but a simple refusal, had ignited hope. And hope is dangerous. The international financial lobby took notice. Whispered warnings spread in Western diplomatic cables. They feared Traore not because he held power, but because he had awakened a sleeping generation. His silence had cracked the illusion of unity built on debt and dependency. He had reminded millions that African self-reliance was not a slogan, but a birthright. And that birthright was finally being claimed not through violence, but through vision. They called it economic sabotage. Weeks after Ibrahim Traoré's refusal to shake Ouattara's hand, the West African Economic Council issued a formal warning: any attempt to replace the CFA franc with an unauthorized currency would result in the suspension of aid and potential expulsion from regional trade networks. French officials added fuel to the fire, accusing Traoré of destabilizing the monetary foundation of Francophone Africa. In private meetings, they lobbied neighboring presidents to distance themselves from Burkina Faso, portraying Traoré as a reckless dissenter, threatening the fragile balance of post-colonial cooperation. Inside Burkina Faso, however, a very different narrative was unfolding. What the old guard saw as defiance, the people saw as courage. University classrooms turned into forums for debating new African money. Markets began accepting local barter-based alternatives, while digital wallets for a pilot version of the currency dubbed Zama quietly circulated among urban youth. The project was no longer an abstract economic theory. It was becoming a lived experiment in self-reliance. Farmers, artisans, and shopkeepers, previously locked out of the CFA-dominated economy, started participating in micro-networks, powered by the idea that Africa could finally set its own terms. As international criticism grew louder, so did the voices of support from within the continent. A group of Pan-African parliamentarians, led by a young MP from Ghana, publicly praised Traoré's stand and called for a continental summit to explore currency alternatives. In Kenya, a documentary titled "The Man Who Didn't Shake Hands" broke viewership records on local streaming platforms. It painted Traoré not as a villain, but as a visionary, someone willing to bear political fire for the sake of future generations. Traoré himself remained calm under pressure. In a rare televised address, he faced the camera and spoke with conviction. "Let them threaten us with hunger, with isolation. But we have already been hungry. We have already been forgotten. What we have not been until now is free." His words struck a chord across borders, especially among the youth. In Lagos, students rewrote the line into a chant: "We have been poor, we have been lied to, but now we will be free." What began as a single rejected handshake had become a rallying cry for an entire generation, a movement rooted in African unity, dignity, and economic sovereignty. The threats of sanctions now seemed desperate, even laughable, in the face of a continent slowly awakening to its own potential. And at the heart of that awakening stood a quiet, unshaken leader who dared to say no, not just to a man, but to a system. They accused him of treason. A leaked intelligence memo from an anonymous West African official claimed that Ibrahim Traoré's currency experiments were being funded by foreign adversaries intent on weakening regional stability. The allegations spread like wildfire. International analysts picked it up, pundits debated it, and headlines screamed that Traoré was a pawn in a shadow war. Within hours, foreign embassies began issuing travel advisories for Ouagadougou, and economic delegations quietly canceled visits. The story was clear: Traoré wasn't a reformer, he was a danger. But the smear campaign had one fatal flaw: the people weren't buying it. Inside Burkina Faso, thousands poured into the streets in peaceful marches, holding up signs that read, "We are the foreign funders, our hearts, our hands, our future." Grassroots organizations quickly launched transparency initiatives, releasing detailed reports about how new African money was being developed with local funding, open-source code, and contributions from African technologists across the diaspora. The more the outside world tried to discredit the movement, the more legitimacy it earned at home. In fact, Traore's government released their own investigation, one that exposed the origin of the leaked memo. It had been drafted not by a neutral regional analyst, but by a communications contractor linked to a French lobbying firm. The backlash was immediate. What had been framed as a security threat was now seen as psychological warfare, an attempt to crush an idea before it became unstoppable. Regional leaders were forced to reconsider their stance. In closed-door sessions, presidents who once echoed France's criticisms began to wonder if they'd backed the wrong side of history. Public opinion across Francophone Africa was shifting fast. Petitions in Mali, Niger, and Guinea called for referendums on whether to abandon the CFA franc entirely. Meanwhile, Traoré stood firm. He convened an emergency summit, but not with presidents, with economists, engineers, farmers, and cultural leaders. For him, real power didn't rest in presidential palaces, but in the minds and labor of the African people. If they fear our money, he said during the opening session, it's because they know it can end their control. But only if we build it ourselves, not in secret, not in silence, but in the open together. That summit, streamed live to over 5 million viewers across the continent, became a milestone. It wasn't just about currency anymore. It was about African self-reliance and the recognition that no liberation is ever granted freely. It must be demanded, built, and defended. Traoré had been branded a traitor, but in the eyes of his people, he had become something far more dangerous to the old order, a symbol of what happens when a leader chooses truth over compromise. They said he was dismantling everything. One European minister publicly accused Ibrahim Traoré of dragging Burkina Faso into economic suicide, and warned of unprecedented consequences if he continued pushing for new African money. Global financial institutions echoed the threat, quietly suspending credit ratings and delaying development loans. Some even suggested military intervention if stability could not be assured. On the international stage, Traoré was painted as an extremist, too radical, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be allowed to lead. What they didn't understand or refused to see was that the man they were vilifying had already turned their threats into fuel. Back home, Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he took to the streets, not with tanks, but with truth. In a groundbreaking national address held in the heart of Ouagadougou's Central Plaza, he stood without a podium, flanked not by bodyguards, but by students, farmers, and entrepreneurs. He looked out into the crowd and said, "They want to scare you into silence. But fear is the oldest currency of empires, and we are minting something new." The crowd erupted. That speech, streamed across the continent, marked the point of no return. Across Africa, the tide was shifting. In Senegal, musicians began producing anthems about self-reliance. In Cameroon, tech hubs named entire projects after Zama, the pilot currency launched under Traoré's administration. In Mali high school, students recited his speeches as part of civic education. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just a national figure, he had become a continental symbol, and that scared the old powers more than any weapon ever could. In response, the pressure escalated. France's media machine doubled down, releasing documentaries framing Traoré as a tyrant, cloaked in revolutionary slogans. Anonymous sources accused him of silencing dissent, though no political prisoner could be named. Western ambassadors issued coordinated statements questioning the rule of law in Burkina Faso. Traoré didn't respond with press releases. He responded with transparency. He invited international observers into the country, not through embassies, but through live-streamed town halls where citizens questioned ministers directly. He declassified economic reports, opened the government's books, and launched a public audit of every CFA-related contract signed in the past 2 decades. The results were damning. Billions had been siphoned off through exploitative mining licenses and debt traps disguised as aid. People no longer needed to be convinced that a new system was needed. They could now see it in numbers, in names, in documents signed in ink, but written in blood. Then came the retaliation. In what was later described as a cyber-political strike, a coordinated attack shut down key government servers and disabled access to Zama digital wallets for over 72 hours. The attackers left behind one message: Africa is not ready. Traore, however, had anticipated it. Within hours, backup systems were deployed. A team of African and diaspora developers restored operations using independent mesh networks powered by solar energy. The restoration was more than technical, it was symbolic. Traore went on air and simply said, "We are not waiting for permission to rise." That defiant spirit inspired more than just words. Rwanda and Guinea quietly sent delegations to Ouagadougou. Angola offered support in natural resource exchange. A Pan-African summit was proposed, not under the AU, but a citizen-led coalition of thinkers, builders, and leaders, not tied to old systems. The summit plan for the following year would focus on one theme: redefining sovereignty. Despite mounting external hostility, the internal resilience only grew stronger. Schools began rewriting curriculum to include African inventors, philosophers, and economists. Communities shifted from aid-dependent programs to cooperative-led development. A new generation of leaders was being groomed, not in Paris or Washington, but in local town halls, innovation labs, and family farms. Traore had not merely started a movement, he had planted a new foundation. But, as the movement grew, so did the danger. Leaked intelligence revealed that private military contractors had been deployed to neighboring states, allegedly preparing contingency operations in case Burkina Faso collapsed. The word collapse became code for refuse obedience. Traore, aware of the threat, didn't militarize, he globalized. He reached out to African communities in the diaspora in Brazil, in the Caribbean, in Europe, calling for a brain return. Engineers, doctors, legal experts, and digital organizers answered the call. Flights arrived every week, with people not seeking opportunity, but returning to build it. When asked by a Western journalist if he feared assassination, Traore replied, "You don't assassinate a man. You assassinate a lie he exposes. And that's much harder." The clip went viral. Commentators called it political theater, but for millions it was truth. A truth that echoed across borders, across languages, across wounds. By the end of the year, New African Money had expanded into 3 more pilot states. While still in development, it had proven what skeptics said was impossible, that a resource-rich, vision-led Africa could operate independently, transparently, and proudly. It hadn't solved every problem, but it had reignited belief, not in one man, but in the collective strength of a people who refused to be bought, silenced, or defined by outsiders. And at the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, not as a messiah, but as a mirror, a reflection of everything Africa had been told it couldn't be, and everything it now dared to become. History doesn't always reward the loudest voices. Sometimes it listens to the quiet ones, the ones who refuse to kneel when the world expects them to bow. Ibrahim Traoré's story is not about perfection. It's about conviction. It's about a man who understood that true leadership begins the moment you stop seeking permission to do what is right. The lesson is not merely political. It is deeply human. In a world shaped by centuries of foreign control and internal compromise, Traoré chose to stand still, not out of pride, but out of purpose. When he refused the handshake, he wasn't rejecting diplomacy. He was rejecting performative unity. He was reminding us that healing cannot come from gestures if the wounds are still open, and worse, if the knife is still in the hand offering peace. His refusal sparked anger. Accusations followed of arrogance, of isolationism, of economic recklessness. But the storm that came was one he had anticipated, because Traoré didn't build his strength in palaces or behind podiums. He built it in the streets, in the classrooms, in the hearts of the youth who had long been told their dreams were dangerous. And in doing so, he reminded us that self-reliance is not a policy, it's a mindset. One that begins when we stop asking for validation and start building our own systems, our own economies, our own stories. New African money was never just about currency. It was a declaration of identity. It said, we are tired of trading sovereignty for stability. It said, we have the resources, the intellect, and the will to build an Africa that does not beg but leads. That lesson hit harder than any sanction. Because for the first time in decades, Africa wasn't reacting, it was initiating. From every challenge thrown at him, media attacks, economic sabotage, cyber strikes, military threats, Traore responded not with fear, but with faith. Faith in his people. Faith in the idea that Africans, when united, do not need permission to govern their own future. His greatest weapon was not his army, but his ability to listen, to open the books, to invite critique even when surrounded by enemies. And in that transparency, he did something powerful. He shifted the battlefield. No longer was the fight about image, it was about truth. And truth has a way of surviving even the fiercest attempts to silence it. The deeper lesson here is that revolutions are not always explosive. Sometimes they unfold in quiet acts of resistance, in a leader refusing to shake a hand, in a farmer using a new currency, in a student reciting a line that once threatened to be erased. These small moments accumulate until suddenly the world changes. Traore's journey teaches us that legacy is not built on global praise, but on the courage to be misunderstood in pursuit of something greater. He was mocked, he was threatened, but he did not yield. Because he wasn't fighting for applause, he was fighting for alignment. Alignment between what Africa says it wants and what it's willing to stand for. We must also learn that unity does not mean uniformity. Traore didn't ask every African nation to agree with him. He asked them to ask themselves, who are we serving? Who is profiting from our pain? That kind of introspection is what scares empires. Because when people begin to think for themselves, they become impossible to control. The story of Ibrahim Traoré is far from over, but the lesson it leaves us today is urgent. We cannot build a free Africa using the tools that once enslaved it. We must create new models, new visions, and most importantly, new courage. Courage to challenge our neighbors when they sell our future for temporary gain. Courage to say no, even when it would be easier to say yes. Courage to build slowly, authentically, and locally, not for the headlines, but for the generations to come. Traoré didn't just fight for a new currency. He fought to remind us that the richest continent on earth should never feel poor. That dignity is not a luxury, that sovereignty is not negotiable, and that freedom, true freedom, begins the moment we stop imitating others and start believing in ourselves. This is the lesson: the world may never applaud your resistance, but history will, and so will your children. The moment Traoré refused that handshake, I knew we were witnessing history. It wasn't just about politics, it was about dignity. For so long we've watched our leaders smile for cameras while signing away our futures. But not this time. Traoré didn't need to shout or fight. That silent act said everything: we will no longer play by their rules. It gave me chills. I'm a young African living in Europe, and for years I felt disconnected from the continent. But hearing Traoré speak about self-reliance, seeing how he mobilized local communities and turned down international manipulation, it made me proud again. It made me believe that real change is not only possible, it's already happening. He's the kind of leader we were told doesn't exist anymore. The Western media can try to twist his image, but they can't erase what we saw with our own eyes. He didn't betray anyone, he protected something sacred. Our sovereignty, our right to build something that is ours. For the first time in a long time, I'm hopeful. Not because the world is changing, but because Africa is standing up. Traoré has sparked something powerful. It's not about one man. It's a movement from Lagos to Bamako, from Nairobi to Paris. We see you, Captain, we hear you, and we are with you.